Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Bicep for Real. This week we're going to be moving on to looking at the data components in our solution and how we can deploy databases into our environment. If you remember, we're working on a real project here looking at Lambda Toys' new cloud-based infrastructure for their ordering and customer service system. And this is what our environment design looks like at the moment. So last week we did the networking layer, we pushed out our virtual network, our network security groups, and now we want to populate those with some resources. And we're going to have a look at the bit on the right here, the data layer, which is primarily going to be focused around Cosmos DB. So we're going to deploy a Cosmos DB resource, and we're going to use private endpoint to join that into our virtual network and lock it down so that it's only accessible from the virtual network. Now we're starting to get to the point where we're deploying things which are going to need to be configured in the way that the development team who are building the application want them. So we've had to go back to them and ask them some questions about, okay, how do you want your Cosmos DB database to be configured? Because we don't know that. We don't have the answers to those questions. So we need to interact with the devs and find out what they want. So we know now that they want the Cosmos DB deployed with the SQL API. So Cosmos has a number of different APIs you can work with, like SQL, table storage, Gremlin, all that sort of stuff. They want to use the SQL one, so we need to configure it with that. Cosmos also has a number of consistency options, and they've elected to go down the session consistency route, so that's fine. We'll configure that. We also need to figure out the data structure they want actually deploying into Cosmos. So they only at the moment need a single container. It's going to be called orders. So we're going to store the order data. And the partition key for this, it needs to be the ID field. So that's fine. That all makes sense. We can use that as part of our configuration. We've also got some requirements for the infrastructure based on some of the other requirements that we were given that are outside of the devs realm. So in particular, when we looked at the requirements last week, we noted there was a big emphasis on keeping costs as low as possible. So one of the things we're going to do here is we're going to have a look at using the serverless option for Cosmos DB, which will make things a lot cheaper. Now, serverless has some drawbacks in terms of performance, so we need to also establish whether or not this is actually feasible. It should be fine for the development environment, but as we move into test and production, it might be that actually we don't want to use that, and so we can figure that out, and we can decide on that, and maybe make our templates flexible enough to support that. Cosmos obviously is a database that has multiple region support. We are going to want that as part of our disaster recovery approach, but we're going to tackle that later. So we're going to leave that off for now. We're going to do the disaster recovery as sort of one big thing. So that's how we need to configure our environment. So I think we've got everything we need there. Let's hop on over to VS Code and we can get started. Okay, so if you remember, this is our core template for last week. We're going to add the Cosmos DB into the core template at the moment. We do want to avoid getting one massive template that does everything, so we might break it out later. But for now, we're going to add it into this template because it'll make us a lot easier when we get to doing the private link part to integrate it with the network. So let's scroll down to the bottom, and we'll come back to the parameters in a bit. So we might need to parameterize some options for this to make them more flexible. We'll see. We'll fill out the options, and then we'll see what we need to parameterize. So let's get started. We're going to use the snippets again because they're a handy tool to fill in the information for us. And for Cosmos, there are a few different components we need to deploy. The first thing is the Cosmos DB account. So if we have a look in the snippets, there should be a Cosmos account option. Okay, and that gives us the basic structure here. And I don't know if you've used these snippets before, any of these gray fields are ones that you can actually tab through. So if I hit the tab key, it's going to move me on to the name field and so on. And you can tab through those and change them. So for the name, we're going to again use our prefix approach. So if we go back up here, we can probably just steal what we did previously for that one. And we'll go ahead and change that to Cosmos account. Okay, location is already done because we named that parameter that. The kind is global document DB. That's the one we want. We're fine with that. For the consistency policy, it's currently set to eventual. Remember, we want session for this, so we'll switch that over. Session doesn't need any information about staleness, so we can get rid of that. And then the locations array here is the different locations we're going to deploy to. As we mentioned, we're only going to do the one at the moment. So the location here is going into the actual location passed into the template variable, which is fine. And the priority is 0, which is the top level priority, which is fine. Database account offer type standard. There aren't any other options, so we don't need those. And then we're going to turn off failover for the minute because there isn't anywhere for it to fail over to. In capabilities, we don't need the enable table because we're not using the table storage key, but we do need to turn on serverless here. That's a capability. So if we just do turn on serverless, which is that one, so enable serverless, that will now set it up to use the serverless option. That's all the information we need for the account. So next up, we need to create the actual database. Again, we'll go back to our snippets and we want SQL database. Now for this one, we need to do something a little bit special in the name because this is a sub-resource of the actual account. What we need to do here is we need to paste in the name of that one and then put a forward slash and we'll use the prefix again and we'll call that like that. So that will then attach it to the one above. For the ID, we don't need that same sort of thing, so we can just use the prefix there. And then for options, we don't need the throughput because we're not actually, because it's serverless, we don't have to set a throughput value, so we can leave that basically empty. So that's the DB. Next, we need to add in the container, and that's the actual container where our data are going to go. So if we go into the resources again, and we go into SQL container, and just in case you get confused here, like I did when I first look at this, when you use container, it actually creates a database option for you as well. We don't need this one, so let's get rid of that. And we just need to look at the actual container piece. So this, you mentioned before, we've got this option here where we sort of put it as a sub-resource of the parent. There is another way to do this, which we've done down here, which is to use the parent flag or property instead. And for that, then we can use that to reference the SQL DB resource directly. So there are two different ways of doing it. For the name, we're just going to call that, use a prefix again, and we're going to call it orders. And the same for the ID. The actual partition key, as I mentioned, that's the ID field, so we're going to use /ID. And we can get rid of the kind field, we'll use the default for that. Now, we're not going to mess about with any of the indexing policies for now, so we're just going to get rid of that section. We might need to do that later if the developers want to tune this, but for right now, we don't need to do that. Okay, so this should now be everything we need to do the deployment. So we've got some other things we need to do, particularly when we're going to look at our private link. But before we do that, I always like to go ahead and deploy these things because then I can debug just this section rather than doing everything in one go and then you've got to work through everything to try and find all the problems. So we'll just save that and go ahead and look at deploying that. Okay, so here we are back at the command line and we're going to use the deployment commands to go ahead and deploy that. There's nothing new here, same thing, just passing it the actual resource group, the template file we want to use, and the parameters file that we're going to pass in. We've not added any new parameters yet, so let's go ahead and run that and see if it deploys. And I do need to remember to switch over to the new command. Forgot that again. Okay, so the deployment actually failed. And so if we look at the error here, we can see that it's talking about a resource not found. So it's complaining that it can't find the database account, so the SQL DB account, that this Lambda Dev Cosmos account over here. And the issue here is related to how we did that parent-child relationship. So if we hop over back to VS Code, and you see here, it's this resource, the actual SQL database, that's the problem. And you see when we set up the name here, we use this account name / database name. And this doesn't work, or this has failed, because we don't have an implicit dependency here between this account and this one. As far as Bicep and ARM's concerned, this isn't an account, it's just a string with a name in it. So it tries to create this before this has been created. So there's a couple of ways we could resolve that. We could either add an implicit dependency in here to say this depends on the account, or we can switch to using the parent syntax, which I think is what we will do. So we'll go over here, we'll go parent, and it's Cosmos DB account is the parent name. So we'll add that in there, and then we'll get rid of that and save that. That will then actually add a dependency because this isn't a string, this is actually a reference to the resource, and Bicep will add that dependency in for us. Go back to the CLI and we'll run that again. Okay, and that's now finished deploying. And if we have a look over at our Azure portal, we can see we've got the Cosmos DB account created here. And if we click on that, we can then have a look into Data Explorer, is probably the easiest place. And we should see we've got our database and we've got our orders table. And if we have a look over there in the index, in the settings, you can see the ID is set to partition key. So that has all worked, and that's working fine. However, what we've got here now at the moment is a database that is connected and open to the world. Obviously, you need credentials to get into it, but it's not locked down and not using private endpoints like we want to look at. So next, we'll go and look at how we can turn on private endpoints and restrict this access just to our network. So we're back in VS Code, and we are going to now add in private endpoints for our Cosmos DB. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than it would be if you did it through the Azure portal. If you ever used the Azure portal to create a private endpoint, there's one wizard, you tick a few boxes, fill in a few fields, and you're good to go. Here, because we were actually using the back-end APIs to do this, there are multiple different components we need to configure to make this work. So the first thing we need to do is sort out the DNS. So if you're familiar with private endpoints, you need a DNS solution for resolving the private records for the resource. Now, the easiest way to do this is to use Azure Private DNS, create the zone, link it to your network, and then link it to your private endpoint, and it will create the records for you. That's what we're going to do. But unlike with the wizard, there's not a tick box. We need to deploy those resources, and there's two of them for the DNS zone. There is the actual DNS zone itself, and then the link to the virtual network. And actually, there's a third one as well, which is the link to the private endpoint. So we go ahead and add them in. Now, for some reason, there isn't a snippet for these, so maybe I'll look at adding one in. But for the minute, we will copy and paste from what I did earlier to avoid you having to watch me type large amounts. So let's put those in. And let me just explain what we've got here. So the first thing we've got is the actual private DNS zone itself, and that one's really simple. You give it the name, and the name is the actual DNS zone you want to use. So you can look these up on the Microsoft Docs for which ones you need for the private endpoints. For Cosmos, we need the private link.documents.azure.com zone. So we're creating that. And then the location, and that needs to be global. If you try and just put the location field in, like doing that, it'll allow you to do it, but when you run it, it will come up with an error saying the private DNS zone's resource has been registered in that location. It's because it's a global one. So keep that at global. And then the second resource here is the actual linking of the private DNS zone to your virtual network. And this one's fairly straightforward. Again, you've got the location being global. You've got the parent record because it comes underneath the private DNS zone. And then you've got the properties, which is basically about the VNet. So the first one, the registration enabled, it will set that to false. This allows registering of virtual machines and so on automatically in the zone. We're not using it for that, so it doesn't matter. We'll turn that off. And then this one is just the ID of the virtual network to link it to. And that will create the zone and link it to the network. Okay, pretty straightforward. Next up, we need to add the actual private endpoint itself. And again, there's not a snippet for this. So I'll paste it in here. All this code will be in the GitHub repo if you want to copy any of it, so that's fine. And so we're going to add the private endpoint resource. The location here is region specific, so we need to add that in. And the main bit of information is in this private link service connection. So it needs a name, you can call that what you like. Again, we're using the prefix to make sure they're unique. But the two important bits are you need the ID of the resource you're attaching the private link to. So this is our Cosmos DB account. Space in there just to make it cleaner. And then you need the group IDs, which is basically the sub-resource that you're going to attach the private endpoint for. So you can't have a private endpoint for, say, Cosmos that covers all the APIs. You have to create one for each if you wanted to do that. Now, we only need the SQL API, so we're going to go and just add the SQL API in here. Lastly, we need to add in the subnet, which the private endpoint is going to be linked to in our network. So what I've done here is basically just taken on our virtual network, looked at the subnets inside it, and that's an array. So I've just got the first value out of that array and used that. So I'm sticking the private endpoint in the first subnet. Now, if we didn't want to do that and we wanted to be more complex and actually sort of pick where our private endpoints went, we'd maybe want to turn that into a parameter or something that says, pass in the name of the subnet that's going to be used or something like that. But we're just going to stick that in the first subnet. And then lastly, what we need is to link the DNS zone to the private endpoint. So that uses this private DNS zone groups property. And again, the parent is the actual private endpoint. And then the private DNS zone config, we give it a name. It can be whatever you want. I just use the DNS zone name to make it clear what that's for. And then the important bit is the actual ID of the DNS zone you want to link to the actual to the private endpoint. And I've missed a bracket off there, so save that. Okay, and that will go ahead and create all those resources and get that set up for us. So let's go back over to the CLI and we're going to run that deployment again and see how that runs. Now, this can take quite a long time creating the private endpoint, so give it a while, and that should go ahead and create all of those resources that we need. And what do you know? It's failed. And I knew this was going to happen, and I forgot to make the change. So, well, this is a good learning example. So this has failed, and you'll see this if you forget about this. Private endpoint cannot be created as subnet has network policies enabled. So the issue here is that private endpoints currently in the GA release don't support network security groups. So you have to disable the network security group only for private endpoints. Everything else still goes through the network security group, but you have to disable it using a flag. Now, supporting NSGs for private endpoints is in preview at the moment. We're not using that. So if you don't disable that, you get this error. And so if we go back to VS Code, what we need to do is go up to our subnet. So all the way up here into this subnet in the properties section. And if we look in here, there's this private endpoint network policies. We click that one, and we need to set that to disabled. Let's go ahead and run that again, and that should sort it out. Okay, so that's finished deploying. If we go back to the portal, you can see now we've got the private link, private endpoint here, sorry, the network card to go along with it, and the DNS zone. We have a look in the DNS zone. We should see we've got the records already created for us, and you'll see we've got two because we've got the top level one, and then we've got one for the region for West Europe. If we had multiple Cosmos regions, you'd see multiple regional records there as well. We quickly go have a look at the Cosmos DB account and then have a look at private endpoint connections. You can see we've got this one here as well. So that's all set up, that's all configured and ready to go. So that's just about it. We've got our Cosmos DB deployed, we've got it configured, we've got private endpoints working. It just needs some data in it now, which is obviously going to come from our developers when we get to deploying the application. So we'll stop there for this week. Hopefully that you enjoyed that and you can see how easy it was to get all that deployed once you found the right code to use. And we'll continue with deploying our solution next week. Thanks for watching.